think the scale of change in China is becoming so overwhelming that they just can't continue repeating the same, trite lines about freedom. I mean, Americans and their idea of freedom, it's not freedom from hunger, it's not freedom from want. It's a bizarre notion of freedom that they have in America. What China wanted was freedom from want, freedom from being forced from poverty to do things rather than having the freedom that a decent income gives you to live. And so that's the Chinese focus. Now, the Americans will continue pushing this freedom nonsense in one of the world's worst democratic systems on the planet.
欢迎来到胤蓝智库。当西方依然在重复关于自由的抽象话术时，顶级学者却抛出了一个极具清醒的反问：如果一种自由不能带来免于匮乏的保障，政治选择也仅限于两党之间的二选一，那么这种自由的实际价值究竟何在？与此相对，中国过去数十年的核心焦点始终是摆脱贫困的实际自由。这种底层逻辑的根本差异正导致两国在国家竞争力和治理成效上出现深刻分化。在今天我们要拆解的对话中，嘉宾抛出了几项硬核的剖析。第一，资本与权力的边界。在西方体系下，资本寡头能够直接主导国家政策，而在中国，资本可以获取收益，但其影响力被严格的约束在体制框架之内。第二，治理精英的结构演变。美国政坛长期偏向于金融资本与资本投机，而在中国治理层则以工程师为主导，始终聚焦于实体资本的形成与技术积累。第三，产业升降与复利效应。按照经济规律，中国生活水平实现翻倍仅需8到9年，而美国则需要35年。哈佛经济复杂性指数更清晰地揭示了两国产业位次的历史性逆转，中美博弈的真实脉络究竟通向何方？接下来的正片，胤蓝智库带你逐层剥离表象，请看正片。
China has billionaires and lots of them, just like the US, right? I'm not a big fan of anyone having that kind of money, I have to say. However, unlike in the West, where the oligarchs are literally sitting at the president's table dictating policy to the rest of us, in China, they aren't letting these people run amok. Like we saw with Jack Ma, the founder of Alibaba, their political power is curbed by the party. They can make their money, but that's where it stops. Is that one of the key reasons for its success as well, do you reckon?
I think so. I mean, this is one thing Z has been criticized all the time as a new Mao. I've seen plenty of that. But friends of mine who live in China, both the Chinese and foreigners, tell me that what he was really doing is cleaning up some extent cleaning up the mess left after the recovery from the global financial crisis. So, the huge real estate bubble that had to be tamed, large investments that are going to fail that had to be covered. So he's been reversing some of certainly the pollution levels have fallen dramatically as well. So all these things require controls, okay? And therefore Z is being put across as being another Mao. But it seems that the whole focus was on improving the physical facilities for the country. And he said that if you want to be rich, become a capitalist. If you want to be becoming a public servant, don't expect to make money. And there's an extremely strong anti-corruption drive in China, and people get executed for corruption. It's still a very brutal regime in that sense. What it means is, and actually one thing, when I was in China, this conference, we had a whole bunch of young students of journalism watching the conference between these sets of journalists that I'd put together. And they asked me about the ombudsman system in Australia. Now, the ombudsman system was borrowed from the Swedes, and that was an idea where there was a state authority making sure that state officials lived up to the objectives they were given. And this seems to be what China's managed to build as well. I didn't give the students the information. It's one of my failings. But this seems to be what China's done. So any public servant has effectively a performance sheet they have to live up to. And if they don't live up to it, then they don't get promoted. So what you get, consequently, this selection city system inside the public service there requires you to perform to set objectives and rewards those who do and blocks those who don't. There is a certain amount of nepotism. I'm not going to say there isn't in a system like that. But what it means is, however, whatever you think about the politics of the people who get to the top, they've shown they can perform. And this means that there's a way of monitoring the behavior and performance of the public sector that Americans think can only be done by the private sector and the profit motive. So instead, they've managed to get, in some ways, a well-disciplined, effective bureaucracy that realizes it has to satisfy the people under its control, so it can't just ignore them as Americans do in public health. And they let rampant competition occur at the same time in the private sector.
When debating China in the West, one fact that's always conveniently omitted is that China managed to lift, 500 million to 800 million out of abject poverty in just a couple of short decades. I had another economist on the show last year, Branko Milanovic, and he said this is probably the biggest economic miracle in the history of our planet. How the hell did they do that?
Well, that's a very good point. It's when I was there again, we'd go to this is in 80s, 45 years ago, and we went to Sichuan, and there were people selling alligator skins on the main street. I mean, it was totally a sort of peasant society at the time. People criticized me for saying, but it's true. The majority of people were peasants, and people who worked the land. Now you've got the majority being industrial workers. And it's an enormous country. So something like 800 million people have been raised out of abject poverty. And the rate of economic growth has been astonishing. The average, over the last 40 years, the average rate of growth of per capita incomes has been about 8% in China. Now, there's a little rule called the rule of 72. You divide your rate of growth into 72, and that tells you how long it takes you to double economic activity. So that basically gives you 8.5 years. 8 or 9 years, doubling living standards every 8 or 9 years. America's rate of growth is per capita improvement's been about 2%. That means it takes 35 years, roughly, to double living standards. So one country's doubling 8 times every 8 years, the other's doubling every 35. No prizes for guessing which one gets there faster. So China's managed to do that, and it's really got an enormous level of capital formation. This is the difference between it and the West. Again, they're focused upon building up the machinery, the means of production, but they've also meant that happens both in the industrial goods sector and the consumer goods sector, which, unlike the Russians who just managed it in the industrial goods sector, and innovation. They want their products to be competitive, not just locally, but also globally. So you've got this huge export surplus they make, which they then reinvest in innovation. The government is running a deficit of up to 10% of GDP. Looking at Bank of International Settlements figures, that means that's another 10% of GDP going pretty much into physical investment. And their banks are private. Their banks are privately operated but publicly owned, fundamentally. So the banks are told they've got to provide working capital for corporations. So there's no shortage of money for investment in China. Whereas there is a shortage of money for investment in America. You can get money for speculation. You want to gamble on house prices, sure, here's a mortgage. Okay? But in terms of working capital for companies, get out of here. So all the financial engines in China are directed towards capital formation and innovation. And most of the financial pressures in America are directed towards speculation on asset prices.
Since you mentioned that during your visit to China in 1981, they told you how they want to prop up their engineering sector. Have you perhaps read Dan Wang's book, Breakneck?
No, I haven't. No.
Okay. He argues that China is essentially run by engineers, as most of the Politburo is made up of engineers, including Xi Jinping, while the vast majority of the American presidents are lawyers, except Trump, obviously. So while China
he's a non-lawyer.
I don't know what he is, but definitely not a lawyer. Yeah. So while China kind of thrives when it comes to huge infrastructure projects and the development of technology, they often tumble when it comes to their sort of social engineering experiments. He says that, and vice versa for America. What do you think of this idea?
Well, I think the social experiments are pretty good as well, actually. They tend to be capitalizing on the history of China. So, like the last time I was in China was 2017. I desperately want to go back, but I haven't had the opportunity yet. And I saw, we were in north of North Korea, so one of the very northern provinces. And when you go walking around a Chinese city, there are people line dancing. Is a huge public activity. So this is something which comes out of the not just the communist days. It goes right back to Confucianism and Taoism and Tai Chi and all these sorts of things. So I saw a woman there who was line dancing, and she must have been 70. And I thought, you were raised during the Mao period, okay? And you would have seen all the privations that applied there. Even possible she was born before World War II, so she would have seen the horrors of the collapse of the Chinese system. And here she is line dancing with a whole bunch of people in an open park and thoroughly enjoying herself. And it's an enormous transition. So the Chinese have managed to hang on to those traditional elements of their culture. And like if you go shopping with a Chinese girlfriend, which I have done, the whole idea that they don't spend is nonsense. So they do have a large amount of social innovation. And it's more consistent with their culture, and their culture was cooperative.
I was watching some of your recent debates on China with Patrick Bat David, admiring your saintly patience, and also with that awful, pardon my language, toad Kevin O'Leary.
Oh, God Almighty, yeah.
But some of these fellas really make my skin crawl. And when you said that in the U.S., when you're walking around any major city, you're literally tripping over a homeless person every 5 seconds, while China covers their country in speed rail and EVs and futuristic infrastructure. All Kevin O'Leary could say to you was, but I don't want my children to be raised as Chinese communists or something along those lines. Is this refusal to acknowledge China's rise coming to an end even amongst these types of
I think
cheerleaders?
I think the scale of change in China is becoming so overwhelming that they just can't continue repeating the same, trite lines about freedom. I mean, Americans and their idea of freedom, it's not freedom from hunger, it's not freedom from want, okay? And it's not even freedom to elect who you'd like to have in power, because you've got two choices, Republican or Democrat. It's a bizarre notion of freedom that they have in America. What China wanted was freedom from want, freedom being forced from poverty to do things, rather than having the freedom that a decent income gives you to live. And so that's the Chinese focus. Now, the Americans will continue pushing this freedom nonsense in one of the world's worst democratic systems on the planet. They'll continue pushing that. But if China doubles again in the next 8 years, which is unlikely, it might take them 15 years this time, then the gap between China and America is going to be so enormous that, forget your talking points. You can't continue with that line anymore. And I think because of the engineering focus that China has, and because they're trying to be self-sufficient, in my opinion, they're likely to come through the next 10 years far better than the rest of the world. So yeah, the American copium over freedom is going to run out of mileage sometime in the next decade.
You think the rise of this sort of more progressive left, like Mamdani, and now we've seen with these local elections, they are having a lot of success within the Democratic Party. Do you think there's this kind of very vehement anti-Trump direction that the country might go in? We don't know if that's going to happen. Might alleviate some of these predictions for the U.S.?
It's really hard to turn out where America's got to, because there's a database called the Atlas of Economic Complexity, which is maintained by Harvard University computer scientists, and that has got a way of looking at how complex different societies are, the complexity of the goods they can produce. America's gone from about number 8 to number 20 over the last 25 years. China's gone from number 20 to number 8 at the same time period. And in fact, if you go back further, of course, China's come from virtually nowhere to up in the top 10 in terms of the complexity of products it can produce in its economy. That means you've got to have lots of engineers and skilled workers who can handle machine tools and design them in the first place. And America doesn't have the capability anymore. It's got there's a wonderful clip with what's his name, Cook, the guy who was head of Apple, saying at a meeting in China that in the audit. If he wanted to have a meeting with all the machine tool experts in America, he could hold it inside the auditorium he was in. If he wanted to have a meeting with all those experts in China, he'd need to have at least a couple of football stadiums. So America doesn't have the skill basis. It doesn't have the education system to train as many engineers as it needs as rapidly as is necessary. So I can't see America making up until it's realized it's been going the wrong way for the last 40 years, and that wrong way is letting the finance sector rule everything. So with the finance sector, they want more borrowed money, privately borrowed money. They want more speculation on non-financial assets, houses and shares. And that's the sort of world you get. You get financial engineers, not real engineers. Until America realized that was a mistake, then I think it's going to continue losing.
Like I said at the beginning, you called the 2008 financial crisis years before it happened. What's your prediction for the sort of short or medium-term economic relations between China and the West?
Oh, China's going to continue. I really believe, I mean, I don't know, but I think one of China's main objectives is to become as self-sufficient as possible, because that's how they were before they were raped by the Americans and the British during the Opium Wars in the 19th century. I'm sure most Americans think the Opium Wars were fought by America to keep Chinese drugs out of America. Okay? In fact, of course, it's the opposite. The Opium Wars were fought to let Europeans sell drugs to China because there's nothing else they could get Chinese people to buy out of the West. Now, that destroyed their industries, destroyed their culture, and of course, that's something every school kid learns in China. Okay?
The century of humiliation.
It's as ubiquitous as in China learning about that as is for Americans learning about the War of Independence, okay, and the Civil War. So they know they can't trust the West, and what the West is doing at the moment, America's ridiculous war in Persia,
Iran,
is making it even more obvious you can't trust them. So I'm sure underlying principle of the various plans is to become completely self-sufficient. Now that means that they can forget about the West, okay, which is what they did beforehand, and the West won't be very happy about that. But I think that's what I expect to happen. And equally, given the technological lead they've got in so many industries now, there's really no way that American companies can catch up without a devaluation. So I simply can't see American cars of similar quality to Japanese cars are about twice as expensive. That means you need a 50% devaluation before you restore price parity. Okay, and I think that's the likely outcome. So American dollar devaluing against the Chinese yuan, China continuing to try to become self-sufficient, but also dominating trade at the same time because that's a source of extra revenue for them.
欢迎回到英兰智库。这段对话跳出了西方媒体的议程设境，从宏观经济与治理结构的视角，给出了3个极其深刻的几层逻辑。第一，金融化国家与公众化国家的分化。哈佛大学经济复杂性图谱显示，过去25年间，美国的经济复杂性排名持续下降，而中国则大幅跃升。美国的金融体系将海量的资金导向房地产与股票的投机，培养的是金融工程师，而中国则将资源持续注入实体产业与技术创新，培养的是物理工程师。当产业空心化危机全面爆发时，美国已很难在实体制造业上完成追赶。第二，绩效考核对资本政治的碾压。西方盲目迷信私营部门与利润动机的绝对效能，结果导致公共服务与基础设施的严重失调。反观中国，建立了一套基于明确绩效的考核体系，并将寡头的政治影响严格限制在体制之外，确保国家机器真正服务于广大公众的现实需求。第三，历史记忆驱动下的自给自足战略，从近代屈辱的外表掠夺到现代无休止的技术封锁，历史记忆已化作中国国家规划中几层的原则，即实现核心产业链绝对自给自足。当庞大的国内市场与高密度的工程师人才深度结合时，西方试图依靠外部垄断施加影响力彻底失效。决定大国兴衰的从来不是漂亮的政治口号，而是实体资产 形成的速度与治理体系的执行力。当美国继续依赖金融杠杆与老旧话术时，其经济活力的长期衰退已经不可逆转。你是如何看待工程师治国对国家长期竞争力的深远影响？欢迎在评论区留下你理性的思考。感谢收看本期胤蓝智库，订阅我们的频道，我们下期深度分析